Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something darker than your bathroom medicine cabinet at 3 a.m. The story of Percocet, America's favourite painkiller turned public enemy number one. Not the sterile pharmaceutical ads with people kayaking pain-free. Not the reassuring doctor in the white coat. I mean the real story. Corporate greed, medical hubris, and a drug that convinced an entire nation that pain was optional, consequence-free, and totally worth ignoring that tiny addiction warning in 8-point font. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to Sarah from Portland who suggested this topic. Your comment about losing a family member to this crisis really stuck with me, and I hope tonight's episode does justice to that story. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and probably for someone who just took their third as needed pill of the night. Oh, and speaking of listening, we're now live on Spotify. You can find the link in the description if you want to take these stories with you wherever you go. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe check the expiration date on anything in your medicine cabinet just to be safe. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a single pill became America's most prescribed painkiller? How did doctors who swore to do no harm hand out prescriptions like Halloween candy? What makes a drug company look at centuries of opium addiction and think, yeah, but what if we made it time-released? Could you spot the difference between legitimate pain relief and the beginning of dependence? Would you trust a pharmaceutical rep in a cheap suit telling you a narcotic was basically non-addictive? And how exactly does a society go from just say no to take 2 every 4 hours? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1996. The internet runs on dial-up, boy bands own the radio, and your doctor just handed you a prescription for OxyContin with a smile and 0 follow-up questions. Good luck. Long before Percocet, before pharmaceutical companies, before anyone thought to put a drug in time-release coating and call it revolutionary, there was the poppy. Beautiful, delicate, and absolutely lethal in the right dose, or wrong dose, depending on your perspective. The opium poppy has been humanity's faithful companion and cruelest betrayer for thousands of years. Ancient Sumerians called it the joy plant. The Egyptians used it medicinally and recreationally. By the time it reached Victorian England, opium dens were as common as Starbucks, and addiction was just called taking your medicine. The poppy didn't ask to be humanity's downfall, it just stood there, looking pretty, oozing sap, and waiting for someone to figure out that dried latex from a seed pod could make all your problems and eventually your life disappear. Picture this. You're a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE. Your back aches from ploughing fields under a merciless sun. Someone hands you a preparation made from dried poppy sap. Within minutes, the pain dissolves. Your muscles relax. The world softens around the edges. It's like someone wrapped your entire nervous system in warm cotton. You feel, for the first time in months, good. Not just pain-free, actually good. This wasn't recreational drug use in the modern sense. This was medicine, religion, and survival, all mixed together in a clay bowl. Ancient civilizations didn't have ibuprofen or heating pads. They had plants, prayers, and hope. The poppy delivered on at least 2 of those. Egyptian medical texts from 1500 BCE mention opium as a treatment for crying children. Yes, they were dosing babies with opium to make them stop fussing. Parenting in ancient Egypt was apparently very efficient and possibly very quiet. By the time the Greeks and Romans got involved, opium was everywhere. Hippocrates, the father of medicine himself, prescribed it. Roman emperors kept it on hand. It was in cough syrups, sleep aids and painkillers. It was the aspirin of the ancient world, except instead of a mild headache remedy, it was a substance that could, and did, kill you if you miscalculated the dose. Here's the thing about opium. It works. It genuinely undeniably works. If you're in pain, opium will erase it. If you're anxious, it'll calm you. If you're struggling to sleep, it'll knock you out like a hammer to the skull. For thousands of years, that effectiveness blinded people to the cost. Because opium doesn't just relieve suffering, it creates dependency. Your body adapts, your brain rewires itself, and soon you're not taking opium to feel good, you're taking it to avoid feeling terrible. Ancient physicians noticed this. They documented withdrawal symptoms, tolerance and compulsive use. But they didn't have the language of addiction yet. They didn't understand neurotransmitters or receptor sites. They just saw people who couldn't stop, and they assumed it was a moral failing, a weakness of character. The poppy didn't care about morality. It didn't care about empires rising or falling. It just grew, bloomed, and waited. When the Silk Road opened trade routes between East and West, opium travelled along it, spreading from Persia to China to Europe. Everywhere it went, the same pattern followed: relief, dependence, despair. By the 19th century, opium had woven itself so deeply into global culture that entire wars were fought over it. The British Empire went to war with China twice, to protect their right to sell opium to Chinese citizens. Millions became addicted, families collapsed, and still the opium flowed. The poppy's legacy isn't just historical, it's genetic, chemical, coded into every opioid painkiller that followed. Morphine, heroin, oxycodone, fentanyl, they're all descendants of that ancient flower. We didn't create the opioid crisis in 1996. We just repackaged it, branded it, and convinced ourselves this time would be different. Spoiler, it wasn't. When morphine was isolated from opium in the early 1800s, doctors thought they'd found a miracle. It was potent, effective, and solved the agonizing problem of battlefield surgery without anesthesia. Wounded soldiers were given morphine freely, generously, and often. The problem? Nobody told them to stop. After the American Civil War ended, thousands of veterans returned home with a new companion: morphine addiction, euphemistically called soldier's disease. It wasn't a disease, it was a dependency, but calling it that would have required admitting the miracle cure had a dark side. Doctors kept prescribing, patients kept using, and the opiate crisis, in its earliest American form, had officially begun. Imagine you're a Union soldier at Gettysburg. A mini ball, a conical lead bullet designed to shred flesh and shatter bone, has just torn through your leg. You're lying in a field hospital that's really just a blood-soaked tent, filled with screaming men and the smell of gangrene. A surgeon approaches with a saw. No gloves, no sterilization, just a blade crusted with the previous patient's tissue. You're about to have your leg amputated, and the only thing standing between you and unimaginable agony is a small glass syringe filled with morphine. They inject you. The world goes soft. The pain doesn't disappear entirely, but it becomes distant, like it's happening to someone else. You can hear the saw working through your femur, but somehow you don't care. Morphine has pulled you out of your body and placed you somewhere safe, somewhere untouchable. After the surgery, they give you more, for the infection, for the phantom pain, for the nightmares, for the fact that you're 19 years old and will never walk normally again. And when you finally leave the hospital and return home to a farm that doesn't need a one-legged worker, you take the morphine with you. This happened to thousands of men. Some estimates suggest that over 400,000 soldiers, Union and Confederate combined, left the Civil War dependent on morphine. They called it soldier's disease, but that name was a lie wrapped in sympathy. It wasn't a disease you caught from contaminated water or a mosquito bite. It was a chemical dependency created by the very medicine meant to save you. Doctors at the time didn't fully understand addiction. They knew that patients developed tolerance, that over time the same dose stopped working and you needed more to achieve the same effect. They knew that stopping suddenly caused horrific withdrawal symptoms, sweating, shaking, vomiting, bone-deep pain, and a psychological despair so profound that some men took their own lives rather than endure it. But they didn't connect those dots into a coherent theory of addiction. They just saw suffering and prescribed more morphine, and it wasn't just soldiers. Morphine was available over the counter in the late 1800s. You could buy it at the general store, mail order it from a catalogue, or get it from your family doctor for everything from menstrual cramps to teething babies. Yes, babies. Mothers dosed their infants with morphine-laced syrups to keep them quiet. Some of those children never woke up. Women, in particular, became a significant portion of morphine users. Victorian society confined them to the home, dismissed their complaints as hysteria, and offered morphine as a cure-all. Bored, isolated and in genuine pain from childbirth injuries or untreated medical conditions, many women found solace in the small glass bottles of tincture that promised relief. By the late 1800s, more women than men were addicted to opiates in America. The medical establishment was slow to respond. Some doctors began advocating for regulation and education. Others defended morphine as essential medicine and blamed addiction on weak-willed patients. The debate raged while people continued to die, from overdoses, from infections caused by dirty needles, from the despair of dependency. Morphine had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It relieved pain. But it also revealed an uncomfortable truth that society wasn't ready to face. Effective medicine could also be dangerous. Relief could turn into dependency. And once you opened the door to opioid use, closing it again was almost impossible. The Civil War had ended, but its pharmaceutical legacy was just beginning. Morphine addiction became America's first large-scale drug crisis, a preview of horrors to come. The only difference. Back then, they didn't have pharmaceutical companies with marketing budgets and sales reps. They just had doctors, patients, and a drug too powerful to control. The soldiers came home from war, but the war, inside them, chemical, neurological, and merciless, never really ended. In 1898, the biopharmaceutical company did something truly remarkable. They looked at morphine addiction and thought, we can do better. Their solution. Diacetylmorphine, marketed under the friendly, approachable name Heroin. Yes, the same buyer that makes your aspirin once sold heroin over the counter as a cough suppressant and non-addictive morphine substitute. Spoiler alert, it was neither non-addictive nor a solution. In fact, heroin was roughly twice as potent as morphine and significantly more addictive. But for a glorious decade, you could buy it at the pharmacy alongside cough drops and tonics. No prescription needed. Bayer eventually stopped production in 1913, but by then, the genie, or rather, the demon, was out of the bottle. Let's pause and appreciate the sheer audacity of this moment in pharmaceutical history. Bayer chemists synthesized heroin in 1894, and within 4 years they were marketing it as a safe, effective, non-habit-forming alternative to morphine and codeine. They sold it in little bottles with cheerful labels. They advertised it in medical journals. They recommended it for everything from tuberculosis to asthma to the common cold. And the name, heroin, came from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, because the drug made patients feel strong and invincible. Heroic. They named an opioid after heroism. It's like calling arsenic feels great or cyanide no worries. At the time, it genuinely seemed like a breakthrough. Heroin was more potent than morphine, which meant you needed a smaller dose to achieve the same effect. Smaller doses, the logic went, meant less risk of side effects and dependency. And because heroin could be taken orally rather than injected, doctors assumed it would be safer and more socially acceptable. No needles, no risk of infection, just a pleasant syrup that soothed your cough and made the world a little brighter. Patients loved it. Of course they did. Heroin doesn't just suppress coughs. It wraps your entire nervous system in warm velvet and convinces you that everything, your job, your family, your existential dread, is going to be fine. For people suffering from chronic respiratory conditions like tuberculosis, which was a death sentence in the late 1800s, heroin offered not just symptom relief but emotional escape. You couldn't cure TB, but you could make dying from it feel a whole lot better. Bayer marketed heroin aggressively. They distributed free samples to doctors. They published studies, paid for by Bayer, naturally, that claimed the drug was safe and effective. They recommended it for children. Yes, children. Got a kid with a persistent cough. Give them heroin. Teething infant keeping you up at night. Heroin syrup. The fact that nobody seemed concerned about dosing children with a substance derived from opium poppies tells you everything you need to know about medical oversight in the early 1900s. But within a few years, problems emerged. Patients who took heroin regularly found they needed more and more to achieve the same relief. When they tried to stop, they experienced withdrawal symptoms that made morphine withdrawal look like a mild case of the sniffles. Sweating, vomiting, hallucinations, bone pain so severe that some users described it as feeling like their skeleton was trying to escape their body. And the psychological craving was even worse, a desperate, all-consuming need that overrode reason, morality, and self-preservation. By 1910, the medical community was starting to realize they'd made a catastrophic mistake. Heroin wasn't less addictive than morphine, it was more addictive. It didn't solve the opiate problem, it amplified it. Cities began seeing clusters of heroin addicts, many of whom had started using the drug as medicine and couldn't stop. Bayer quietly stopped marketing heroin in 1913. They didn't issue a recall, they didn't apologize, they just moved on to other products and hoped everyone would forget. But heroin didn't disappear. It went underground, transforming from a respectable pharmaceutical product into an illegal street drug associated with crime, poverty, and moral decay. The irony is almost poetic. Bayer had tried to create a safer alternative to morphine and instead created something worse. They'd looked at an addiction crisis and responded with better marketing rather than better science. And in doing so, they set a template that pharmaceutical companies would follow for the next century. When in doubt, rebrand the problem and sell it as a solution. Heroin's transformation from miracle cure to public menace took less than 20 years. But the lessons, those took a lot longer to learn. And as we'll see, some of them still haven't sunk in. By 1914, the United States had a problem. Opiate addiction was rampant, unregulated, and sold in everything from cough syrup to baby teething powder. So Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Act, the country's first real attempt to control dangerous drugs. It required prescriptions for opiates and cocaine, taxed their sale, and criminalized unauthorized distribution. On paper, it looked great. In practice, it created a black market overnight, turned addicts into criminals, and did almost nothing to address the medical and social roots of addiction. Doctors who tried to treat addiction by prescribing maintenance doses were arrested. Patients who couldn't quit went underground. And thus began America's century-long tradition of fighting drug problems with laws that sounded tough but solved nothing. The Harrison Act wasn't sold as prohibition, it was sold as regulation. A reasonable tax and registration system to track narcotic sales and ensure medical use remained medical. Politicians promised it would eliminate the dope fiend problem by cutting off supply to recreational users while preserving access for legitimate patients. It was a beautiful theory that collapsed on contact with reality. Here's what actually happened. The moment the Harrison Act took effect, tens of thousands of Americans who'd been using opiates, some recreationally, many medically, suddenly found their supply cut off. pharmacies that once sold laudanum and morphine over the counter now required prescriptions, and doctors, terrified of prosecution, stopped prescribing maintenance doses to dependent patients. The law didn't distinguish between someone using morphine to manage chronic pain and someone using it to chase a high. If you were dependent, you were now a criminal. Patients who'd been functioning members of society, taking their daily morphine tincture and holding down jobs, were suddenly faced with a choice: suffer through brutal withdrawal, find a sympathetic doctor willing to risk arrest, or turn to the black market. Guess which option most people chose? Within months, illegal drug networks exploded. Street dealers, many with no medical knowledge, began selling morphine and heroin of wildly inconsistent purity. Users had no way to know if the powder they bought was 10% pure or 90%. Overdoses skyrocketed. Deaths mounted. And because addiction was now criminalized, people stopped seeking help. You didn't go to the hospital for an overdose if it meant getting arrested. Some doctors tried to help. They set up maintenance clinics where addicts could receive controlled doses of morphine or heroin in a medical setting. These clinics reduced crime, prevented overdoses, and helped people stabilize their lives. But federal agents shut them down, arrested the doctors, and prosecuted them for illegally distributing narcotics. The message was clear. Addiction was a crime, not a medical condition, and treating it with compassion made you a criminal too. The Treasury Department, which enforced the Harrison Act, took an especially aggressive stance. They argued that any prescription for an addict was illegal because addiction itself wasn't a legitimate medical condition. It didn't matter if the patient had been using morphine for 20 years to manage pain from an injury. If they were dependent, they were criminals, and the doctor prescribing to them was a drug dealer. The Supreme Court eventually weighed in with a series of rulings that made everything worse. In 1919, they upheld the arrest of a doctor who'd prescribed morphine to maintain an addict. The court ruled that addiction wasn't a disease, and maintenance prescribing wasn't legitimate medical practice. Thousands of doctors stopped treating addicts entirely. Patients were abandoned. The human cost was staggering. People who'd been stable for years spiraled into withdrawal, desperation, and crime. Some turned to alcohol, which was still legal at the time, though prohibition would soon change that too. Others committed suicide rather than face life without their medication. And the black market thrived, creating the infrastructure for organized crime that would dominate American cities for decades. The Harrison Act didn't eliminate drug addiction. It drove it underground, criminalized suffering, and ensured that people who needed help got handcuffs instead. It was a policy designed by people who believed addiction was a moral failure that could be legislated away. They were wrong, and a century later we're still living with the consequences. The war on drugs didn't start in the 1980s with Reagan and Just Say No. It started in 1914 with a tax law and good intentions, and it's been a disaster ever since. From the 1920s through the 1970s, opiates largely faded from mainstream American consciousness. Addiction became something associated with jazz musicians, back-alley junkies, and moral failure. Not your neighbour, not your family doctor's patient, and definitely not you. Prescription opioids still existed, but doctors prescribed them cautiously, sparingly, and only for severe pain like cancer or post-surgery recovery. There was a cultural understanding, maybe even a fear, that opiates were dangerous. People remembered the morphine addicts, the heroin scares, the overdoses. For a brief moment in American history, opiates were treated with the respect and terror they deserved. And then the 1980s arrived, and everything changed. During these quiet decades, something remarkable happened. Medical culture developed an institutional memory about opioids. Older doctors mentored younger ones with warnings. Medical schools taught that opiates were powerful tools to be used rarely and briefly. Pharmacology textbooks dedicated entire chapters to addiction risk. It wasn't perfect, nothing in medicine ever is, but there was genuine caution. If you walked into a doctor's office in 1965 complaining of back pain, you'd probably leave with the recommendations for rest, heat, maybe some aspirin, opiates. Only if you had cancer or were recovering from major surgery, and even then prescriptions were small, closely monitored, and accompanied by stern warnings. Doctors had seen what happened when opiates were prescribed freely. They'd lived through the morphine addiction crisis. They'd watched heroin destroy lives. They weren't eager to repeat those mistakes. This caution was reinforced by culture. The 1930s through the 1950s saw a wave of anti-drug propaganda films and campaigns. Reefer Madness gets all the attention now for its absurd portrayal of marijuana, but there were similar scare campaigns about heroin. These films depicted addicts as gaunt, desperate criminals lurking in dark alleys, cautionary tales of moral decay. It was stigmatizing and often cruel, but it did create a powerful cultural association. Opiates equal danger. The 1960s and 70s complicated things. The counterculture embraced drug experimentation, but mostly with psychedelics and marijuana. Heroin was still around, particularly in urban areas and among Vietnam veterans, but it carried a stigma even within drug-using communities. Heroin users were seen as having crossed a line, gone too far. It was the drug of desperation, not recreation. Meanwhile, in medical journals, researchers were documenting something important. Patients given opiates in hospital settings for acute pain rarely became addicted. A person receiving morphine for a broken leg didn't typically develop cravings once the pain subsided and the medication stopped. This made sense. The drug was being used appropriately for severe pain for a limited time under supervision. But here's where things get tricky. Some researchers began extrapolating from this data, arguing that the addiction risk from medical opioid use was vastly overblown. They pointed to studies showing that hospitalized patients rarely became addicted and suggested that opiophobia, excessive fear of prescribing opiates, was causing unnecessary suffering. These arguments were made in good faith by people genuinely concerned about undertreated pain. What they didn't fully appreciate was context. Hospital patients receiving opiates were in controlled environments with defined endpoints. Their pain was acute, not chronic. They weren't taking bottles of pills home to manage on their own. The comparison to outpatient prescribing was flawed, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. By the late 1970s, a quiet shift was beginning. Some pain specialists argued that America's collective opiophobia was outdated and inhumane. They published papers suggesting that addiction risk from medical use was minimal and that doctors were letting patients suffer needlessly. Most of the medical establishment remained skeptical, but the conversation was changing. Pharmaceutical companies were watching. They saw an opportunity. If they could convince doctors that opiates were safe for routine use, the market potential was enormous. Chronic pain, back pain, arthritis, headaches, fibromyalgia affected millions. If opiates could be repositioned from last resort medications to first-line treatments, the profits would be staggering. The quiet decades were ending. The stage was being set for a radical transformation in how America thought about pain, pills, and the trade-off between relief and risk. Doctors who'd been trained to fear opiates were about to be told their caution was cruel, and an entire generation of patients was about to become a vast, unintended experiment in what happens when you forget the lessons of history. The calm before the storm wasn't peaceful. It was just quiet enough that when the thunder finally came, nobody was prepared. In the 1980s and 1990s, something shifted in American medicine. Pain, once seen as an unavoidable part of illness and recovery, was suddenly rebranded as unacceptable, inhumane, and most importantly, treatable. Medical organizations, patient advocacy groups, and yes, pharmaceutical companies began pushing the idea that pain was undertreated in America. They argued that patients were suffering needlessly because doctors were too afraid of addiction. They introduced the concept of pain as the fifth vital sign, right up there with blood pressure and heart rate. Hospitals were judged on patient satisfaction scores that included pain management. Doctors were told that leaving a patient in pain was a failure of care. It all sounded compassionate, progressive, humane, and it was also the perfect setup for what came next. The revolution began with good intentions. Pain specialists looked at cancer patients writhing in agony during their final days and asked a reasonable question. Why are we letting people suffer when we have medications that could help? They published studies showing that terminally ill patients often received inadequate pain control because doctors feared hastening death or causing addiction. These concerns, they argued, were misplaced. A dying patient's comfort should be the priority. Hard to argue with that, and nobody really did. Palliative care, using opiates to manage pain at the end of life, became standard practice. It was humane, ethical, and appropriate. But then the logic started expanding. If undertreating pain in dying patients was cruel, wasn't undertreating pain in anyone cruel? If a cancer patient deserved relief, didn't a chronic back pain sufferer? What about someone recovering from surgery or dealing with arthritis or living with fibromyalgia? Where was the line? Organizations like the American Pain Society began advocating for pain to be recognized as the fifth vital sign, something that should be assessed at every medical visit, right alongside temperature, pulse, respiration, and blood pressure. The Joint Commission, which accredits hospitals, issued new pain management standards in 2000. Hospitals were required to ask patients about pain, document it, and treat it aggressively. On the surface, this seemed patient-centered and compassionate, but it created perverse incentives. Hospitals were judged partly on patient satisfaction scores, and those scores included questions about pain management. If patients reported uncontrolled pain, satisfaction scores dropped. Lower scores meant less reimbursement from Medicare and Medicaid. So hospitals pressured doctors to keep patients pain-free, not for medical reasons, but for financial ones. Doctors found themselves in an impossible position. If they didn't prescribe opiates and patients complained of pain, they risked poor evaluations, angry patients, and administrative reprimands. But if they prescribed too freely, they risked creating dependency. The incentive structure pushed them toward prescribing. Meanwhile, patient advocacy groups, some genuinely concerned about suffering, others funded by pharmaceutical companies, launched campaigns arguing that pain was undertreated in America. They published statistics claiming that millions suffered unnecessarily. They framed opiophobia as a form of medical neglect, and they insisted that addiction fears were overblown, especially for patients with real pain. This last claim was particularly insidious. The idea that people in genuine pain couldn't become addicted, or that addiction in pain patients was somehow different, less serious, became widely accepted despite having virtually no scientific support. It was wishful thinking masquerading as medical fact. Doctors who'd been trained to use opiates sparingly were now being told they were undertreating pain and causing needless suffering. Medical conferences featured pain specialists arguing that opiophobia was the real crisis. Pharmaceutical companies sponsored continuing education courses that emphasized the safety and efficacy of opioid therapy for chronic non-cancer pain. The message was, everywhere, patients are suffering, you have the tools to help, and your reluctance is the problem. It was a perfect storm. Compassionate intentions, flawed science, financial incentives, and aggressive marketing all converged to create an environment where prescribing opiates became not just acceptable, but expected. The cultural and institutional memory that had kept opioid prescribing in check for decades was systematically dismantled. Pain became an enemy to be defeated rather than a symptom to be understood. And opiates were positioned as the weapon of choice. Doctors who questioned this approach were labelled as cruel or outdated. Patients who reported pain expected and often demanded pills. The pain revolution wasn't a conspiracy. It was a genuine, if misguided, attempt to reduce suffering. But it rested on a fundamental miscalculation: the belief that we could widely prescribe highly addictive drugs without creating a crisis. That belief, however well-intentioned, was catastrophically wrong. By the mid-1990s, the stage was set. American medicine had been convinced that pain was undertreated, that opioids were safe, and that addiction fears were exaggerated. All that was needed was the right drug, marketed the right way, to the right audience. Enter Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma wasn't always a household name. For decades, it was a mid-size pharmaceutical company, owned by the Sackler family, known mostly for selling earwax remover and laxatives. But in the 1990s, the Sacklers had bigger ambitions. They wanted a blockbuster drug, something that would print money and cement their legacy. They found it in oxycodone, an opioid that had been around since 1917 but never achieved mass-market success. Purdue's chemists didn't invent oxycodone. They just repackaged it with a time-release coating and a new name, OxyContin. It was marketed as a breakthrough in pain management, a drug so advanced, so controlled that addiction was supposedly rare. That claim would go down as one of the most dangerous lies in pharmaceutical history. The Sackler family's involvement in pharmaceuticals began with three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond. Arthur, the eldest, was the brilliant one, a psychiatrist who revolutionized pharmaceutical marketing in the 1950s and 60s. He pioneered aggressive advertising directly to doctors, offering free samples, sponsoring conferences, and buying influence through medical journals. Arthur made his fortune marketing Valium for Roche, turning a tranquilizer into a cultural phenomenon. By the time he died in 1987, he'd established the playbook: identify a common condition, position your drug as the solution, saturate doctors with marketing, and watch the prescriptions roll in. Mortimer and Raymond, who controlled Purdue Pharma, inherited Arthur's marketing genius and his ruthless business instincts. But they needed a product. For years, Purdue sold mostly unremarkable medications. Profitable, sure, but nothing revolutionary. They wanted something bigger. In the early 1990s, they found their opportunity. MS-Contin, a time-release morphine formulation Purdue had been selling for cancer pain. It was moderately successful, but morphine carried baggage, cultural associations with addiction, end-of-life care, and serious illness. The Sacklers realized they needed a different opioid, one without morphine's stigma. Oxycodone fit perfectly. It had been around for decades, used mostly in combination products like Percocet. It was effective, well-studied, and less culturally loaded than morphine. Purdue's chemists developed a time-release formulation similar to MS-Contin but using oxycodone instead. They called it OxyContin, a name that sounded medical, scientific, controlled. The time-release mechanism was marketed as revolutionary. The drug would release slowly over 12 hours, providing steady pain relief, without the peaks and valleys of immediate-release opioids. This, Purdue claimed, made it less prone to abuse and addiction. The logic seemed sound. If the drug didn't create a rapid high, users wouldn't develop the psychological reinforcement that drove addiction. There was just one problem. It wasn't true. Or rather, it was only true if patients took the pills exactly as directed, swallowed whole. But opioid users quickly discovered that crushing the pills bypassed the time-release coating. delivering the full dose immediately, a massive, potentially lethal high. Purdue knew this was possible. They knew it early, and they did virtually nothing to stop it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1995, OxyContin was still in development, and Purdue was preparing its launch. They assembled a sales force unlike anything the pharmaceutical industry had seen for a painkiller. Over 1,000 sales representatives were hired, trained, and sent into the field with one message: OxyContin is safe, effective, and rarely addictive. The Sacklers weren't just selling a drug, they were selling a philosophy that pain was undertreated, that opiophobia was harming patients, and that OxyContin was the solution America had been waiting for. They targeted doctors in rural areas, general practitioners who saw lots of patients with chronic pain and didn't have specialized training in pain management or addiction. These doctors were overwhelmed, under-resourced, and eager for solutions. Purdue's sales reps arrived with studies, industry-funded studies, showing OxyContin was effective and safe. They downplayed addiction risk with a statistic that would become infamous: the claim that less than 1% of patients treated with opioids became addicted. This figure was based on a 5-sentence letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980, describing hospitalized patients who received short-term opioid treatment. It had nothing to do with long-term outpatient prescribing for chronic pain. But Purdue cited it anyway, over and over, until it became accepted fact. Doctors trusted Purdue. Why wouldn't they? This was a pharmaceutical company with a respected name, FDA approval, and glossy marketing materials. If they said OxyContin was safe, it must be safe, right? The Sacklers positioned themselves as philanthropists. They donated to museums, universities, and medical institutions. Their name appeared on hospital wings and art galleries. They were respected, admired, part of the cultural elite. Nobody suspected they were building an empire on addiction. By 1996, everything was in place. The drug was approved. The sales force was trained. The marketing machine was humming. All that remained was to unleash OxyContin on an unsuspecting public and watch the money roll in, and roll in it did. Within a few years, OxyContin would become Purdue's best-selling product, generating billions in revenue. The Sacklers would become obscenely wealthy, and across America, in small towns and suburbs, medicine cabinets would fill with little time-release pills that promised relief and delivered devastation. The family business was booming. The body count was just beginning. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin with a marketing blitz, unlike anything the pharmaceutical world had seen for a painkiller. Glossy brochures, free samples, lavish dinners for doctors, and an army of sales reps armed with one key message. OxyContin's time-release formula made it safer and less addictive than other opioids. The magic claim? That because the drug released slowly over 12 hours, it didn't create the euphoric high that led to addiction. It was a promise built on sand. Early studies were small, biased, and misrepresented. But Purdue didn't care. They had a product to sell, and America's doctors, overwhelmed, undertrained in pain management and trusting, were ready to buy. Prescriptions skyrocketed. OxyContin became the go-to solution for everything from back pain to wisdom teeth removal, and in living rooms, medicine cabinets, and bedside tables across the country, a slow-motion disaster was unfolding. The launch wasn't subtle. Purdue spent $200 million on OxyContin marketing between 1996 and 2001, an astronomical sum for a painkiller. They created videos, pamphlets, and training materials, all emphasizing one theme: pain is undertreated, and OxyContin is the solution. Sales representatives descended on medical offices like a well-dressed plague. They brought lunch for the entire staff, sandwiches, pizza, catered meals, and while everyone ate, they delivered their pitch. They handed out branded merchandise, pens, notepads, coffee mugs, even plush toys, all emblazoned with the OxyContin logo. They offered free weekend conferences at luxury resorts, where doctors could earn continuing education credits while listening to Purdue-funded speakers extol OxyContin's virtues, and they targeted strategically. Purdue identified high-prescribing doctors, physicians who saw lots of patients with chronic pain, and lavished extra attention on them. These doctors received more visits, more perks, more invitations. Purdue tracked prescription data and knew exactly which physicians were writing the most scripts. The more you prescribed, the more attention you got. It was a feedback loop designed to maximize sales. The core of Purdue's pitch was the 12-hour claim. Unlike other painkillers that needed to be taken every 4 to 6 hours, OxyContin provided relief for 12 hours. This meant fewer pills, better compliance, more consistent pain control. For patients juggling work, family and chronic pain, the convenience was appealing. For doctors, it seemed like a genuine improvement over older opioids. But the real selling point was safety. Purdue's reps insisted that OxyContin's time-release formula made it less prone to abuse and addiction. They cited that infamous statistic about less than 1% addiction risk. They showed graphs and charts suggesting OxyContin was different, better, safer. Some marketing materials even described the addiction risk as less than 1%, a claim so misleading it bordered on fraud. Doctors believed it, not because they were stupid or corrupt, but because they trusted the system. The FDA had approved OxyContin. Purdue was a legitimate pharmaceutical company. The studies, flawed as they were, seemed convincing. And the pain revolution had primed doctors to see opioid reluctance as cruel and outdated. Prescriptions exploded. In 1996, OxyContin generated $45 million in revenue. By 2000, it was over $1 billion. By 2010, $3 billion. The growth was exponential, and Purdue couldn't have been happier. Patients noticed relief almost immediately. For people living with chronic back pain, arthritis, or fibromyalgia, OxyContin delivered. It worked. It genuinely worked. For the first time in years, some people could sleep through the night, go to work, play with their kids. The drug did what it promised. It controlled pain. But then the problem started. Some patients found the 12-hour claim didn't hold. Their pain returned after 8 or 9 hours. They called their doctors, desperate. And instead of questioning whether the drug was flawed, doctors increased the dose. Not the frequency, that would undermine the 12-hour marketing, but the strength. Patients went from 10 milligrams to 20, 40, 80, even 160 milligrams per pill. Higher doses meant more intense effects. Some patients started feeling euphoric. They described a warm, floating sensation, a sense that everything was okay. It wasn't just pain relief, it was emotional relief. And that feeling, that sense of well-being, was dangerously seductive. Tolerance developed quickly. The same dose that worked brilliantly for the first month stopped working by month 3. Patients needed more. Doctors, believing they were treating undertreated pain, prescribed more. The cycle accelerated. And then there was the abuse. People quickly figured out that crushing OxyContin pills bypassed the time-release mechanism. You could chew them, crush and snort them, or dissolve and inject them. Doing so delivered the full 12-hour dose instantly, a massive, overwhelming high. It was dangerous, often lethal, and it spread like wildfire. Purdue knew. Internal documents later revealed that company executives were aware of abuse, diversion, and addiction as early as 1997. They knew people were crushing pills. They knew emergency rooms were seeing overdoses. They knew their 12-hour claim was failing for many patients. And they did nothing. Or rather, they did worse than nothing. They kept marketing, kept pushing, kept insisting OxyContin was safe. By the early 2000s, OxyContin had become America's best-selling painkiller and its fastest-growing addiction crisis. Purdue had promised everything: relief without risk, convenience without consequences. What they delivered was profit without accountability, and the cost, measured in overdoses, shattered families and communities devastated, was just beginning to be calculated. Purdue Pharma didn't just sell OxyContin, they weaponized it. The company deployed over 1,000 sales representatives across the United States, targeting doctors in rural areas, pain clinics, and general practices. These reps weren't just passing along information, they were running a calculated campaign of manipulation. They offered free trips, meals, and speaker fees. They downplayed addiction risks and inflated benefits. They used dubious data to claim that less than 1% of patients became addicted, a statistic later revealed to be grossly misleading. Doctors who prescribed high volumes of OxyContin were rewarded with more attention, more perks, more visits. It was a feedback loop of profit and prescriptions, and it worked horrifyingly well. By the early 2000s, OxyContin was Purdue's cash cow, raking in billions. But the human cost was already mounting: overdoses, addiction, families shattered, and Purdue knew. Internal documents later reveal that company executives were aware of abuse and diversion as early as 1997. They didn't pull back, they doubled down. The Sackler sales machine operated with military precision. Every sales representative received intensive training, not just on the drug's pharmacology, but on persuasion techniques. They learned how to identify and exploit doctors' concerns. Worried about addiction? Here's a study showing it's rare. Concerned about regulatory scrutiny? OxyContin is FDA approved and recommended by pain specialists. Hesitant about prescribing opioids? You're letting your patients suffer needlessly. Purdue tracked everything. They used prescription data to identify which doctors were prescribing OxyContin and how much. High prescribers were flagged and rewarded. Sales reps received bonuses based on prescription volume in their territories. The more pills doctors prescribed, the more money reps made, the more attention those doctors received. It was capitalism at its most ruthless, dressed up in medical legitimacy. The perks weren't subtle. Doctors were invited to weekend conferences at beach resorts and ski lodges. They received payments to give talks about pain management, talks that just happened to emphasize OxyContin's benefits. Some doctors made tens of thousands of dollars from these speaking fees. It wasn't technically bribery, but it created a clear conflict of interest. You don't accept money from a company and then objectively evaluate their product. Purdue's marketing materials were masterpieces of manipulation. One video featured patients describing how OxyContin had transformed their lives, allowing them to return to work and family activities. These testimonials were powerful and persuasive. What the video didn't mention was that some of those patients would later become addicted, and some would die from overdoses. The company created charts comparing OxyContin favorably to other painkillers, emphasizing its 12-hour duration and time-release safety. They printed these charts on glossy brochures and left them in doctors' offices. Patients sitting in waiting rooms saw them. The message was clear. OxyContin is different, better, safer. Sales reps were taught to overcome objections. If a doctor expressed concern about addiction, reps had a script. Studies show that addiction is rare in patients with real pain. What you're seeing isn't addiction, it's pseudo-addiction, where undertreated pain mimics drug-seeking behavior. The solution is more medication, not less. Pseudo-addiction. It's a term that deserves special attention. Introduced in a single case study in 1989, it described a patient whose drug-seeking behavior resolved when pain was adequately treated. Purdue seized on this concept and weaponized it. They trained sales reps to tell doctors that patients demanding early refills or higher doses weren't addicted, they were undertreated. The solution? Prescribe more. This was gaslighting on an industrial scale. It reframed addiction as a dosing problem. Patients exhibiting clear signs of dependence, tolerance, withdrawal, compulsive use were told they simply needed better pain control. Doctors who might have recognized addiction were given an alternative explanation that fit Purdue's narrative, and it worked. Prescriptions soared. By 2000, OxyContin was being prescribed for conditions that previously wouldn't have warranted opioid treatment: moderate back pain, dental procedures, sports injuries. The threshold for what constituted severe enough pain kept dropping. Purdue also targeted vulnerable populations. They focused heavily on Appalachia, rural communities, and economically depressed areas. These regions had high rates of chronic pain from physical labor, limited access to alternative treatments like physical therapy, and doctors who were overwhelmed and under-resourced. It was the perfect market. Sales reps visited the same doctors repeatedly, sometimes weekly. They built relationships, learned about doctors' families, remembered birthdays. It wasn't just business, it was personal. And when you have a personal relationship with someone who's bringing you lunch and showing you studies and telling you that you're helping patients, it's hard to maintain objectivity. Some doctors resisted. They saw patients becoming dependent and refused to keep prescribing. But they were in the minority. Most trusted Purdue. Most believed they were treating pain appropriately. And some, a small but significant number, didn't care. They saw an opportunity to make money by running pill mills, and Purdue's generous supply of OxyContin made it easy. By the early 2000s, internal Purdue documents showed executives celebrating their success, while privately acknowledging problems. Emails discussed abusers, addicts, and diversion. They knew OxyContin was being crushed and snorted. They knew people were dying, and their response wasn't to pull back, it was to protect their market share. The Sackler family personally profited from every prescription. They withdrew over $10 billion from Purdue between 2008 and 2017, even as lawsuits piled up and the death toll mounted. The sales machine they'd built was efficient, ruthless, and devastatingly effective. It turned doctors into unwitting distributors and patients into casualties, and it made the Sacklers some of the wealthiest people in America. The machine is largely dismantled now. Purdue filed for bankruptcy. The Sacklers have been stripped of their philanthropic prestige, but the damage, measured in hundreds of thousands of deaths, can never be undone. The sales machine worked exactly as designed. That's the tragedy. OxyContin's entire marketing pitch rested on one claim. The time-release formula provided 12 hours of pain relief. That was the selling point, the innovation, the reason doctors felt comfortable prescribing it for chronic pain. But there was a problem, a big one. For many patients, the drug wore off in 8 hours, sometimes 6. The pain came roaring back, often worse than before, a phenomenon known as breakthrough pain. Patients called their doctors desperate for relief, and instead of acknowledging the flaw, Purdue's solution was simple and sinister. Tell doctors to increase the dose, not the frequency. That would admit the 12-hour claim was false, but the strength. Patients went from 10 milligrams to 20, then 40, then 80. Higher doses meant more euphoria, more dependence, and more addiction. Internal emails from Purdue showed executives knew the 12-hour window was failing, but feared that admitting it would destroy their market dominance. So they stayed quiet, and patients paid the price in shattered lives and shallow graves. The 12-hour promise wasn't just marketing, it was OxyContin's entire identity. Purdue had designed the drug to compete with existing painkillers by offering convenience, take it twice a day instead of every 4 hours. For patients managing chronic pain while working, caring for families, or simply trying to sleep through the night, this sounded like a godsend. Purdue's FDA approval explicitly stated that OxyContin provided 12 hours of pain relief. The label said so, the marketing material said so, sales reps said so, and for the first few weeks many patients did experience 12 hours of relief. But over time, as tolerance developed and the body adapted to the medication, that window narrowed. Patients began reporting that their pain returned after 8 or 9 hours. They'd wake up, in the middle of the night, aching, unable to get back to sleep. They'd call their doctors describing the pain's return. And here's where Purdue's strategy became truly insidious. Instead of acknowledging that the 12-hour claim was failing, Purdue instructed sales reps to tell doctors the solution was higher doses. Internal training materials explicitly stated, do not change dosing interval, increase dose. Not prescribe every 8 hours, that would undermine the 12-hour marketing. Instead, double the strength. So patients went from 10 milligrams every 12 hours to 20 milligrams. When that stopped working, 40, then 80, then 160. Purdue manufactured pills in increasingly high doses specifically to accommodate this escalation. They were literally creating a dosing ladder that led patients into dependency. Here's the cruel mathematics. A patient on 80 milligrams every 12 hours was getting a higher total daily dose than someone taking 20 milligrams every 6 hours, but the latter regimen would have provided more consistent pain control. Purdue prioritized preserving the 12-hour claim over patient welfare, and higher doses didn't just mean more pain relief, they meant more euphoria. At lower doses, OxyContin mostly controlled pain. At higher doses, it created a high. Patients described feeling warm, relaxed, disconnected from stress and worry. For people dealing with chronic pain, often compounded by depression, financial stress, or trauma, that psychological relief was powerfully reinforcing. The euphoria wasn't a side effect. It was the drug working on brain chemistry in ways that had nothing to do with pain. And once patients experienced it, stopping became exponentially harder. They weren't just physically dependent, they were psychologically hooked on the feeling of everything being okay. Purdue knew the 12-hour claim was failing. A Los Angeles Times investigation in 2016 uncovered internal company reports from the late 1990s showing that Purdue executives discussed complaints about inadequate duration of action. They knew patients were experiencing breakthrough pain. They knew doctors were frustrated. But admitting the problem publicly would have been catastrophic for business. OxyContin's market advantage was the 12-hour duration. If that claim collapsed, the drug would be just another opioid, competing with cheaper generics. Purdue's stock answer was always to increase the dose, never the frequency. This strategy had deadly consequences. Higher doses meant higher risks: respiratory depression, overdose, death. Patients who might have been relatively safe on lower doses taken more frequently were instead on dangerously high doses that made every pill a potential killer. Some doctors figured it out and started prescribing OxyContin every 8 hours despite Purdue's guidance. But many followed Purdue's recommendations, trusting that the company knew its own drug best. That trust was misplaced. The 12-hour lie wasn't just false advertising, it was medical negligence on a corporate scale. Purdue prioritized marketing over medicine, profit over safety, and brand integrity over human life. And when patients paid the price, Purdue didn't accept responsibility. They blamed doctor prescribing, patient non-compliance, individual weakness, anything except their own dishonesty. The FDA eventually caught on, but far too late. Investigations revealed the scope of Purdue's deception. Lawsuits documented how the company had knowingly misled doctors and patients. But by then, millions had been prescribed escalating doses, and many were either dependent, addicted, or dead. The 12-hour promise was the foundation of OxyContin's success. It was also a lie, and that lie, maintained for years while people suffered and died, encapsulates everything wrong with putting pharmaceutical profits ahead of public health. Purdue built an empire on a failing formula and a false claim. The empire eventually crumbled. The damage it caused never will. While OxyContin grabbed headlines, another oxycodone-based drug was quietly dominating medicine cabinets: Percocet. First approved in 1976, Percocet combined oxycodone with acetaminophen, the same ingredient in Tylenol. It wasn't time-released or aggressively marketed like OxyContin, but it didn't need to be. Percocet became the go-to prescription for moderate pain, dental work, minor surgeries, injuries. It was seen as gentler, safer, more controlled. But oxycodone is oxycodone, whether it's in a time-release shell or mixed with Tylenol. And as OxyContin's marketing machine normalized opioid prescriptions, Percocet rode the wave. Doctors handed it out routinely, patients took it without question, and dependents crept in quietly. Percocet didn't create the opioid crisis, but it was there at every step, a constant, understated presence in the pharmacological disaster unfolding across America. Percocet's origin story is almost quaint compared to OxyContin's aggressive launch. Developed by Endo Pharmaceuticals and approved in 1976, it was designed as a combination painkiller, oxycodone for pain relief, acetaminophen to enhance effectiveness and theoretically discourage abuse. The logic was that acetaminophen, in high doses, is toxic to the liver, so if someone tried to abuse Percocet by taking excessive amounts, they'd poison themselves before getting very high. It was harm reduction through threat of organ failure, creative, if deeply flawed. Percocet came in various strengths: 2.5, 5, 7.5, and 10 milligrams of oxycodone, each combined with 325 milligrams of acetaminophen. The lower doses seemed innocuous, almost friendly. A doctor could prescribe Percocet 5-325 and feel like they were being conservative, cautious, reasonable, and for years that's exactly what happened. Percocet was prescribed routinely for post-surgical pain, dental extractions, broken bones, and other acute conditions. You'd go in for wisdom teeth removal, and you'd leave with a prescription for 30 Percocet tablets. Take 1 or 2 every 4 to 6 hours as needed for pain. Most people took a few, felt better, and threw the rest in a bathroom drawer. But that calculus changed in the 1990s and 2000s as OxyContin's marketing reshaped prescribing culture. Suddenly, doctors who'd been cautious about opioids were being told that undertreating pain was cruel. The same rhetoric that sold OxyContin made Percocet prescriptions balloon. Dentists, who'd previously recommended ibuprofen and ice packs, started routinely prescribing Percocet. Orthopedic surgeons handed out prescriptions for 60, 90, even 120 pills after minor procedures. The threshold for what warranted an opioid prescription dropped dramatically. Percocet had advantages over OxyContin in some ways. It was cheaper. It had been around longer, so doctors were familiar with it. And because it wasn't time-released, patients could feel relief faster. Pop a Percocet and within 30 minutes pain dulled. It was immediate, predictable, effective. But those same qualities made it dangerous. The rapid onset meant a quicker, more noticeable high for people predisposed to addiction. And because Percocet was prescribed so routinely, it flooded into communities, filled medicine cabinets, and became readily available for diversion. Teenagers raiding their parents' medicine cabinets after dental surgery became a gateway to opioid use. Someone would take a Percocet left over from their mum's back surgery and discover it didn't just kill pain, it made everything feel better. Anxiety melted, stress disappeared. For a few hours, life felt manageable. Percocet's combination with acetaminophen created its own problems. People taking multiple pills to chase a high were also ingesting massive amounts of acetaminophen, risking liver damage or failure. Emergency rooms saw patients arriving in liver crisis after binging on Percocet, their bodies shutting down from acetaminophen toxicity even as they experienced opioid withdrawal. Purdue's OxyContin marketing indirectly boosted Percocet prescriptions. As doctors became more comfortable prescribing opioids generally, all opioid scripts increased. Percocet benefited from the rising tide. It wasn't marketed aggressively, but it didn't need to be. The cultural shift OxyContin created lifted all opioid boats. Some patients started on Percocet for legitimate pain, developed tolerance, and found themselves needing more. Their doctors, now comfortable with opioid prescribing, escalated to higher doses or switched them to OxyContin. Percocet became the entry point, the introduction to opioid dependency that led to stronger, more dangerous drugs. And unlike OxyContin, which faced intense scrutiny and eventual reformulation, Percocet flew under the radar. It wasn't the poster child for the opioid crisis. It didn't generate billions for a single company. It was just there, quietly, in millions of medicine cabinets, prescribed millions of times a year, creating dependence one patient at a time. Doctors often viewed Percocet as the safer opioid choice. It wasn't long-acting like OxyContin. It had the acetaminophen safety mechanism. It seemed moderate, reasonable, appropriate. But oxycodone doesn't care how it's packaged. Whether it's time-released or immediate, whether it's alone or combined with Tylenol, it binds to the same receptors, triggers the same dependency mechanisms, and carries the same risks. Percocet's role in the opioid crisis is quieter than OxyContin's, but no less significant. It was the drug handed out after every minor surgery, every dental procedure, every sports injury. It was the pill sitting in bathroom drawers across America, waiting to be found by a curious teenager or a desperate adult. It was the bridge between I'm in pain and I'm dependent, and it's still there. While OxyContin has been reformulated and scrutinized, Percocet continues to be prescribed millions of times annually. The doses are lower now, the quantities smaller, but the fundamental risk remains. Percocet didn't create the crisis, but it was and is an essential part of the infrastructure that sustains it. The quiet sibling, still working in the shadows while the loud one takes the blame. By the early 2000s, emergency rooms started seeing a disturbing pattern. Previously healthy people arriving in withdrawal, overdose, or desperate for refills. These weren't stereotypical addicts. They were teachers, construction workers, retirees, suburban mums, people who'd done everything right. They'd taken their medication as prescribed, trusted their doctors, and still ended up dependent. Some tried to quit and couldn't. Others found that their prescriptions ran out but their need didn't. A few turned to the black market or, worse, heroin, which was cheaper and easier to find than pills. The medical community was slow to respond. Addiction was still stigmatized, still seen as a personal failing rather than a chemical inevitability. And so the wave grew, quietly at first, then unstoppably, until entire communities were drowning in pills, dependency, and grief. The first wave didn't announce itself with sirens. It crept in quietly, one patient at a time, until suddenly emergency departments were overwhelmed. Nurses and doctors began noticing patients they recognized, not because they were frequent flyers with chronic conditions, but because they kept coming back with the same complaint. They'd run out of pills early, their pain had returned, they needed a refill. At first, medical staff assumed these were isolated cases of poor pain control. Adjust the dose, extend the prescription, try a different medication. But the pattern persisted. Patients who'd been stable on opioids for months would suddenly escalate, needing higher doses more frequently. When questioned, they described tolerance. The same dose that had worked initially no longer touched their pain. Tolerance is a predictable pharmacological phenomenon with opioids. Your body adapts. Receptors become less sensitive. You need more drug to achieve the same effect. For patients, this felt like a betrayal. They'd been told opioids were safe, that addiction was rare, that they could take medication as prescribed without problems. Now they were in a trap, escalating doses, growing dependence, and doctors who were starting to look at them with suspicion. Some physicians recognized dependency developing and tried to taper patients off opioids. But tapering is brutally difficult. Reduce the dose too quickly and withdrawal hits. Muscle aches, sweating, nausea, anxiety, insomnia, and a psychological despair that feels like drowning. Patients beg to stay on their medications, some doctor-shopped, visiting multiple physicians to get overlapping prescriptions. Others turn to the internet, buying pills from overseas pharmacies. Emergency rooms became battlegrounds. Patients in genuine withdrawal arrived desperate, sometimes violent, demanding medication. Staff struggled to distinguish between drug-seeking behavior and legitimate medical need. Some hospitals developed protocols: no opioid refills in the ER, refer to primary care, offer alternatives like NSAIDs or nerve blocks. But these policies, while well-intentioned, sometimes left patients in agony. Overdoses began climbing. In the late 1990s, opioid overdose deaths were relatively rare. By 2004, they'd more than doubled. By 2008, they'd doubled again. Coroners reported deaths from respiratory depression. People stopped breathing in their sleep, bodies found with pill bottles on the nightstand. These weren't intentional suicides mostly, they were miscalculations. Someone in pain took an extra pill, combined it with alcohol, took their regular dose after a tolerance break, or received pills of inconsistent strength from the black market and accidentally overdosed. The margin between effective dose and lethal dose was narrower than people realized, especially as tolerance increased. Communities started noticing. In small towns across Appalachia, the Midwest, and rural America, everyone knew someone affected. The teacher who'd always seemed healthy suddenly lost weight, missed work and looked haunted. The construction worker who used to coach Little League was arrested for prescription fraud. The neighbor's kid, honor student and athlete, was found dead from an overdose. Families were devastated and confused. These weren't people who'd sought out drugs. They'd followed doctors' orders. They'd taken medication prescribed by licensed physicians from legitimate pharmacies. How had this happened? The medical community was slow to acknowledge the crisis. Some doctors defended opioid prescribing, arguing they were treating undertreated pain. Others blamed patients for misusing medication. The idea that the drugs themselves, prescribed appropriately, could create dependency challenged everything they'd been taught by Purdue sales reps and pain management advocates. Support groups began forming, first online, then in person. People shared stories that sounded eerily similar. Started opioids after surgery. Prescription ran out, couldn't stop. Life spiraled. These groups provided community but also revelation. People realized they weren't alone, weren't uniquely weak or flawed. Something systemic was happening. Law enforcement noticed too. Police departments saw increases in prescription fraud, pharmacy robberies and doctor shopping arrests. Pills were being diverted, sold on the street for $1 per milligram. An 80-milligram OxyContin could fetch $80. People desperate to maintain their supply turned to crime, and hovering over all of this was stigma. addiction carried moral judgment. People who became dependent on prescription opioids felt shame, hid their struggles, and avoided seeking help. They didn't fit the cultural image of an addict, the street junkie with a needle, so they didn't identify as addicts. They were just people in pain who couldn't stop their medication. The first wave of the opioid crisis was characterized by this cognitive dissonance, prescription medications taken as directed causing addiction. It challenged assumptions about safety, medical authority, and personal responsibility. And while policymakers, pharmaceutical companies, and medical organizations debated what to do, the wave kept growing. By the late 2000s, the opioid epidemic was undeniable, but the response remained fragmented, inadequate, and far too slow. The first wave had crested, but it hadn't broken, and worse, it was about to transform into something even deadlier. The patients had become statistics, and the statistics were staggering. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new kind of business emerged, the pill mill. These were clinics, often in strip malls or run-down buildings, where doctors handed out opioid prescriptions for cash with barely a glance at the patient. No physical exam, no medical history, no follow-up, just $100 and a script for 120 pills. Florida became the epicenter. At one point, 85 of the top 100 oxycodone dispensing doctors in the United States were in the Sunshine State. Patients drove from other states, waited in lines like a fast food drive-thru, and walked out with months' worth of pills. Some resold them. Others took them all. Many died. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. Shutting down one clinic just meant 2 more opened down the street. It was the Wild West of pharmaceuticals, and the body count was staggering. The pill mill phenomenon exposed every flaw in prescription, drug regulation. Legally, doctors have wide latitude in prescribing. As long as they're licensed and the medication is FDA approved, they can prescribe it for virtually any reason they deem medically appropriate. Oversight is minimal. State medical boards are chronically underfunded and reactive rather than proactive. By the time a bad actor gets shut down, they've operated for months or years. Pill mills exploited this regulatory gap ruthlessly. The business model was simple. Set up a pain clinic, hire a doctor willing to write prescriptions with minimal oversight, charge cash for visits, and prescribe massive quantities of opioids. Patients paid anywhere from $50 to $300 per visit. No insurance billing, no paper trail, just cash. The doctors running these operations were often licensed physicians, though sometimes they'd had disciplinary issues in other states, or were nearing retirement and didn't care about consequences. They'd see dozens of patients per day, spending minutes per visit. Walk in, claim you have chronic back pain, get a prescription for 120 OxyContin 80s. Next patient. Lines formed outside these clinics at dawn. People drove from Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas, some traveling 6 or 8 hours, to reach Florida pill mills. They'd arrive with cash, wait their turn, see the doctor, fill their prescriptions at nearby pharmacies, and drive home. Some made the trip monthly. Others became regular customers, knowing exactly which clinics were still open and which had been raided. The pills flowed north along I-75, nicknamed the OxyContin Express. People would fill prescriptions in Florida, drive back to their home states, and sell pills for massive markups. A pill that cost $1 in Florida could sell for $20 or $30 in rural Kentucky. The profit margins were enormous. Florida became the pill mill capital for specific reasons. The state had lax regulations on pain, clinics. Unlike many states, Florida didn't have a prescription drug monitoring program, PDMP, until 2011, absurdly late. Without a PDMP, there was no centralized database tracking who was prescribing what to whom. Doctors and pharmacies operated in isolation. A patient could visit 5 different clinics in one day, get 5 prescriptions, and fill them all without anyone noticing. Pharmacies near pill mills became complicit, either through willful ignorance or active participation. Some pharmacies filled millions of opioid prescriptions annually, volumes that should have raised red flags. A tiny pharmacy in a small town shouldn't be dispensing more oxycodone than major hospital systems. But they did, and they profited. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. The DEA and state agencies could shut down individual clinics, but it was like playing whack-a-mole. Close one, and another opened nearby. Arrests were made, some doctors and clinic operators went to prison, but the business model was too profitable to kill. Patients caught in this system often started with legitimate pain and prescriptions from legitimate doctors. But when their prescriptions ran out and their doctors became reluctant to continue opioids, they turned to pill mills. It was easier than dealing with insurance, pain management referrals, and the stigma of being labelled drug-seeking. Pill mills didn't just fuel addiction, they killed people. Overdoses spiked in areas with high pill mill activity. Families lost loved ones. Communities watched helplessly as their neighbours, friends and children fell into addiction. And still the clinics operated, often openly advertising their services. The human cost was grotesque. People died in clinic parking lots after receiving prescriptions and immediately taking massive doses. Others overdosed at home. Some resorted to crime to fund their pill mill visits. And the pills that didn't get consumed locally were sold on the black market, spreading dependency across multiple states. Florida finally acted in 2011, implementing a PDMP and cracking down on pill mills with aggressive enforcement. The impact was immediate. Within a year, oxycodone prescribing in Florida dropped dramatically. Pill mills closed. The OxyContin Express slowed. But the damage was done. Millions of pills had flooded communities. People dependent on those pills didn't just quit when the supply dried up. They turned to other sources, street dealers, the dark web, and increasingly heroin. The pill mill era wasn't an aberration, it was capitalism applied to addiction. Supply met demand with brutal efficiency. Regulatory failures allowed it. Greed sustained it. And when it finally ended, it didn't solve the crisis. It just transformed it into something worse. In 2010, after years of lawsuits, investigations, and mounting deaths, Purdue Pharma introduced a reformulated OxyContin. The new pills were designed to be abuse deterrent, harder to crush, chew, or dissolve for injection. Purdue marketed it as a responsible response to the crisis they'd helped create. But there was a problem. Millions of people were already addicted, and when they couldn't crush the new pills, they didn't just quit. They switched to something stronger, cheaper and deadlier, heroin. The reformulation didn't stop the crisis, it transformed it. Overdose deaths didn't drop, they shifted. The opioid epidemic entered its second wave, and this one came from the streets, not the pharmacy. The reformulation was, on paper, a technological achievement. Purdue's chemists developed a polymer matrix that made the pills turn into a gummy, uncrushable mass when you tried to break them down. You couldn't snort them. Dissolving them for injection was nearly impossible. Chewing them just created a sticky, disgusting blob. For people taking OxyContin as prescribed, nothing changed. The pills worked the same way orally. But for people who'd been abusing them, crushing, snorting, or injecting, the reformulation was a disaster. Their method of use no longer worked. The intense, immediate high they'd been chasing was suddenly inaccessible. Purdue presented the reformulation as a public health victory. They withdrew the original formulation from the market, making the abuse-deterrent version the only option. They lobbied the FDA to approve language on the label, describing the abuse-deterrent properties. They marketed it as evidence of corporate responsibility. See? we're solving the problem. But they weren't. Because addiction doesn't stop when you make one drug harder to abuse. It just shifts to whatever's available. And what was available increasingly was heroin. For years, heroin had been declining in the United States. It was expensive, hard to find, and carried massive social stigma. But as prescription opioid abusers found their supply cut off or reformulated into uselessness, heroin filled the void. The economics were compelling. By 2010, a single 80mg OxyContin pill on the black market cost $50 to $80. A bag of heroin cost $10 or $20. For someone spending hundreds of dollars a week on pills, heroin was a cheaper alternative that provided the same or stronger high. The transition was predictable and tragic. People who'd never considered using heroin, who viewed it as a line they'd never cross, found themselves crossing it out of desperation. The physical agony of withdrawal, combined with the psychological craving, overrode moral boundaries and fear. Heroin dealers recognized the opportunity. They marketed to prescription opioid users explicitly. Some even crushed pills and mixed them with heroin to ease the transition. The message was clear: same high, lower price, readily available. Studies later documented this shift. Researchers found that in areas where OxyContin abuse had been high, heroin overdoses surged after the reformulation. It wasn't coincidence, it was direct cause and effect. Purdue had closed one pipeline and opened another. The reformulation also had unintended consequences for people taking OxyContin legitimately. Some patients reported the new formulation didn't work as well, that pain control was less effective. Pharmacologically, this didn't make sense, the drug should have worked the same. But perception matters in pain management, and patient complaints were widespread enough to generate controversy. Critics pointed out that Purdue benefited financially from the reformulation. The abuse deterrent formulation was still under patent, while the original formulation was about to face generic competition. By withdrawing the original and replacing it with a new version, Purdue extended their monopoly and protected profits. The FDA played along. They approved the abuse deterrent labeling despite limited evidence that it would reduce abuse in the real world. And they allowed Purdue to withdraw the original formulation, effectively forcing the market to the new version. But the real-world impact was devastating. Heroin use, which had been stable or declining, exploded. Between 2010 and 2013, heroin-related overdose deaths doubled, and this was just the beginning. The heroin flooding the market in the early 2010s was different from previous decades. It was cheaper, more potent, and often cut with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. Users had no way to know what they were getting. One dose might be manageable, the next could kill. Emergency rooms that had been dealing with prescription opioid overdoses now faced heroin overdoses. First responders carried Narcan everywhere. Public health departments scrambled to implement needle exchange programs and overdose prevention sites. But the scale of the crisis was overwhelming. Purdue's reformulation was hailed internally as a success. Abuse of OxyContin did decline. The new pills were harder to misuse. But the broader crisis worsened. People still died just from different drugs. The reformulation hadn't saved lives, it had changed the supplier. And Purdue bore responsibility. They'd spent years creating a market for opioid abuse through aggressive marketing, false claims, and willful ignorance of diversion. When forced to reformulate, they did so in a way that protected profits while abandoning the people they'd addicted. The second wave of the opioid crisis, the heroin wave, was a direct consequence of the first, and Purdue's reformulation was the bridge between them. They'd marketed addiction in pill form, then made the pills harder to abuse without addressing the underlying dependency. Millions of people were left stranded, dependent, and desperate. Some found treatment, many didn't. And heroin dealers, seeing an opportunity, stepped in to fill the gap. The reformulation didn't fix anything. It just moved the crisis from the pharmacy to the street, and on the streets it became far deadlier. By the early 2010s, heroin, a drug many Americans thought was a relic of the 1970s, was back with a vengeance. But this wasn't the heroin of jazz clubs and back alleys. This was suburban heroin, driven by people who'd started with a prescription and ended up chasing the same high with whatever they could find. Heroin was cheaper than pills. A single OxyContin could cost $50 to $80 on the street. Heroin, $10 or $20. For someone already dependent, the math was simple and devastating, and the new users weren't prepared. They didn't know dosages, didn't know purity, didn't know the risks. Overdoses surged. By 2015, heroin deaths had quadrupled from a decade earlier. The opioid crisis had evolved, and it was far from over. Heroin's resurgence caught public health officials off guard. For decades, heroin use had been concentrated in urban areas associated with poverty and crime. It was seen as a problem affecting a specific demographic, one that mainstream America could ignore. But when prescription opioid users transitioned to heroin, the demographic shifted dramatically. Suddenly, heroin users were white, suburban, and middle class. They were former athletes, college students, office workers. They were people who'd started with a prescription after a car accident or surgery and ended up dependent. When pills became too expensive or inaccessible, they turned to heroin. This demographic shift changed the cultural conversation. When heroin was seen as an urban minority drug, the response was criminalization and incarceration. But when white suburban kids started dying, the narrative shifted to compassion, treatment, and disease. The hypocrisy was stark and infuriating, but it did create political momentum for change. Heroin dealers adapted to the new market. They operated in suburbs, not just cities. They used cell phones and social media to connect with customers. Some even offered delivery services, meeting buyers in parking lots or quiet streets. The stigma of buying heroin persisted, but dealers made it as easy and discreet as possible. The heroin itself was different too. Historically, heroin in the US came in two forms: black tar from Mexico and powder from South America or Southeast Asia. By the 2010s, Mexican cartels dominated the market, producing cheap, high-purity heroin specifically for the expanding American market. Purity was a double-edged sword. Higher purity meant a more potent high, but also greater overdose risk. Users accustomed to pills had no frame of reference for heroin dosage. They didn't know that a tiny amount could be lethal, and because heroin quality varied wildly between batches, even experienced users couldn't reliably gauge potency. Overdoses followed a predictable pattern. Someone would buy heroin, not knowing its strength. They'd use the same amount they'd used before, or what seemed like a reasonable dose based on their pill habit. But if the heroin was purer than expected or cut with fentanyl, respiratory depression would set in within minutes. Without intervention, Narcan, rescue breathing, emergency services, they'd stop breathing and die. The transition from pills to heroin also meant a transition in method of use. Pills were swallowed. Heroin was typically snorted or injected. Injection carried additional risks: infections, abscesses, HIV, hepatitis C, needle-sharing spread disease. Dirty injection techniques caused bacterial infections that ravaged hearts, spines, and brains. Public health departments tried to respond. Needle exchange programs, which had existed in some cities for decades, expanded. These programs allowed people to trade used needles for clean ones, reducing disease transmission. They were controversial. Critics argued they enabled drug use, but evidence showed they saved lives without increasing addiction rates. Narcan distribution ramped up. First responders, harm. reduction organizations and even family members received training on how to administer naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal drug. Narcan kits became as common as fire extinguishers in some communities. Laws were passed allowing people to carry and administer Narcan without liability, but prevention efforts struggled. Once someone was dependent on opioids, the path to recovery was steep. Withdrawal was brutal. Treatment options were limited. Medication-assisted treatment, using methadone or buprenorphine to manage cravings, was effective but heavily stigmatized and regulated. Insurance coverage was inconsistent. Many people cycled through periods of abstinence and relapse. Heroin use created a chaotic lifestyle, scrambling for money, chasing the next dose, avoiding withdrawal. Jobs were lost, relationships fractured. Some people ended up homeless, living in tent encampments or abandoned buildings, and through it all, the deaths mounted. Local news became a grim parade of obituaries, young people who died unexpectedly, a euphemism everyone understood. Families held funerals and tried to make sense of how a prescription for back pain had led to a heroin overdose. The heroin resurgence also exposed class and race disparities in drug policy. When crack cocaine devastated black communities in the 1980s and 90s, the response was mass incarceration and harsh mandatory minimums. When opioids and heroin hit white communities in the 2010s, the response was treatment, compassion, and calls for reform. Both responses were inadequate, but the contrast was damning. Addiction was always a public health crisis, but it was only recognized as such when it affected the right demographic. By the mid-2010s, heroin had become endemic in many communities. It was no longer shocking, it was background noise, a constant threat. Parents warned their teenagers, schools held assemblies, but the stigma and shame remained, preventing many people from seeking help until it was too late. The opioid crisis had entered its second phase. Pills had been the gateway, heroin was the consequence, and the worst was yet to come. Just when the heroin crisis seemed like it couldn't get worse, fentanyl entered the picture. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. It was originally developed for cancer patients and end-of-life care, situations requiring extreme pain control. But somewhere along the way, it leaked into the illegal drug supply. Dealers started cutting heroin with fentanyl to increase potency and profits. The problem? Fentanyl is incredibly potent and incredibly unforgiving. A dose the size of a few grains of salt can be lethal. Users had no idea what they were taking. One batch of heroin might be weak, the next laced with enough fentanyl to stop a heart in seconds. Overdose deaths exploded. First responders carried Narcan everywhere, morgues overflowed, and the opioid crisis entered its third and deadliest wave. Fentanyl was synthesized in 1960 by Belgian chemist Paul Janssen. It was a medical breakthrough, an opioid so potent that tiny doses could manage severe pain. Fentanyl patches, lollipops, and IV formulations became standard in hospitals and hospices. For cancer patients in excruciating pain, fentanyl was a godsend, but its medical applications were narrow and controlled. Fentanyl's potency made it dangerous. Miscalculate the dose even slightly, and respiratory depression could be fatal. It was meant for supervised clinical settings, not street use. How fentanyl ended up in the illegal drug supply is a story of globalization, profit, and desperation. Chinese chemical manufacturers began producing fentanyl and its analogues, chemical cousins with similar effects, for export. These weren't pharmaceutical companies making medicine, they were clandestine operations producing drugs for the black market. Fentanyl powder could be manufactured cheaply and shipped internationally in small packages. Because it's so potent, a kilogram of fentanyl could be cut into millions of doses. The profit margins were astronomical. Mexican cartels already supplying heroin to the US market recognized fentanyl's potential. They could cut heroin with small amounts of fentanyl, increasing potency while reducing costs. Or they could press fentanyl into counterfeit pills designed to look like pharmaceutical opioids, Percocet, Vicodin, OxyContin. Users thought they were buying pills. They were getting fentanyl. The problem was consistency, or lack thereof. Mixing fentanyl into heroin required precision. A tiny amount provided a powerful high. Too much killed. But street dealers weren't pharmacists. They mixed by eye using crude methods. One batch might have hotspots, areas of concentrated fentanyl. A user could split a bag with a friend, both taking the same amount. One survived, the other died because they got the hotspot. Overdose deaths, which had been climbing due to heroin, skyrocketed with fentanyl's arrival. In 2013, fentanyl was involved in about 3,000 overdose deaths in the US. By 2016, that number had jumped to 20,000. By 2021, over 70,000. Fentanyl overdoses looked different. Heroin overdoses typically gave people time, minutes where they'd nod off, breathing would slow, and intervention could save them. Fentanyl overdoses were faster. People collapsed, stopped breathing, and died before anyone realized something was wrong. First responders described arriving at scenes where people were blue, not breathing, already in cardiac arrest. Narcan still worked, but it often required multiple doses. Some overdoses needed 4, 5, even 6 doses of Narcan to reverse, far more than heroin. The fentanyl crisis created new challenges. Traditional harm reduction advice, start with a small dose, don't use alone, became less effective because even a small dose could be lethal. Fentanyl test strips became available, allowing users to test their drugs for fentanyl before using. But test strips weren't foolproof, and not everyone had access. Public awareness lagged. Many people, including casual drug users, didn't realize how dangerous fentanyl was. Someone might buy what they thought was a Percocet from a friend or dealer, not knowing it was a counterfeit pill pressed with fentanyl. One pill could kill. Teenagers and young adults were particularly vulnerable. Experimentation that might have resulted in a bad experience or minor overdose in previous eras now resulted in death. Parents found their children dead in their bedrooms, a single counterfeit pill on the nightstand. The fentanyl wave also hit people who weren't regular drug users. Casual users, people who took opioids occasionally at parties or to manage stress, died from what they thought were safe, familiar drugs. The margin for error had disappeared. Law enforcement struggled to respond. Fentanyl was easy to smuggle, small, odorless, and didn't require the large-scale infrastructure of heroin production. Traditional drug interdiction strategies, designed for cocaine and heroin shipments, were less effective against a substance so potent it could be mailed in an envelope. And fentanyl kept evolving. Analogues like carfentanil, an elephant tranquilizer up to 100 times more potent than fentanyl, appeared in the drug supply. Each new analogue required different doses of Narcan and posed new risks to users and first responders. The third wave of the opioid crisis wasn't just deadlier numerically, it was qualitatively different. Fentanyl turned drug use into Russian roulette. Every dose was a gamble, and the house always won eventually. By the late 2010s, fentanyl had become the dominant driver of overdose deaths, surpassing both prescription opioids and heroin. The crisis that had started with pills in medicine cabinets had evolved into something unrecognizable, a synthetic drug epidemic where users had no idea what they were taking, and every use could be their last. The invisible killer had arrived, and it wasn't leaving. For years, the Sackler family lived in luxury, their name emblazoned on museum wings, university buildings, and philanthropic initiatives. But as the opioid crisis deepened, public anger grew. Lawsuits piled up from states, cities, families, and survivors. Investigators uncovered emails showing the Sacklers knew about OxyContin's dangers and pushed sales anyway. In 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy as part of a controversial settlement. The Sacklers agreed to pay billions but admitted no wrongdoing. Their name was stripped from museums, but no one went to jail. For many, it wasn't justice. It was a billionaire's escape hatch. The opioid crisis had destroyed millions of lives, but the people most responsible walked away wealthy, untouchable, and barely apologetic. The Sackler family's downfall was slow, public, and ultimately unsatisfying. For decades, they'd operated in the shadows, their control of Purdue Pharma known to insiders but invisible to the public. They donated generously to cultural institutions, the Sackler Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Sackler Library at Oxford, Sackler Galleries and centres at universities worldwide. Their philanthropy was strategic. It brought respectability, influence, and a shield against scrutiny. Who would investigate a family funding cancer research and art museums? The Sacklers cultivated an image of refinement and benevolence, even as Purdue Pharma's marketing machine fueled an addiction crisis. But by the 2010s, the facade was cracking. Investigative journalists, particularly at the Los Angeles Times and the New Yorker, began documenting Purdue's role in the opioid epidemic. Patrick Radden Keefe's exhaustive reporting exposed the Sacklers' personal involvement in Purdue's aggressive marketing strategies. Emails and internal documents, uncovered through litigation, were damning. They showed family members pushing for higher sales targets, minimizing addiction concerns, and extracting billions in profits even as overdose deaths climbed. Richard Sackler, former Purdue president, wrote emails discussing OxyContin abusers as scum and culprits, blaming victims rather than acknowledging the company's role. Lawsuits multiplied. States sued Purdue for deceptive marketing. Counties and cities sued for the cost of responding to the opioid crisis, emergency services, addiction treatment, foster care for children of addicted parents. Families sued for wrongful death. The Sacklers were named personally in many suits, piercing the corporate veil and targeting their personal fortunes. Public protests followed. Activists staged die-ins at museums bearing the Sackler name, their bodies scattered on gallery floors holding pill bottles. Photographers documented these protests, creating powerful images that museums couldn't ignore. One by one, institutions began distancing themselves. The Louvre removed the Sackler name from its walls. The Tate Galleries in London refused future Sackler donations. American museums followed. The Sacklers claimed they were being scapegoated, that Purdue had acted responsibly, that addiction was a complex problem they hadn't caused. But the evidence overwhelmed their denials. The marketing strategies, the suppressed research, the billions withdrawn even as the crisis worsened. It all pointed to conscious choices prioritizing profit over lives. In 2019, facing thousands of lawsuits and potential criminal charges, Purdue Pharma filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing was strategic, designed to consolidate litigation and negotiate a global settlement. The Sacklers offered to pay roughly $4.5 billion over time, give up ownership of Purdue, and transform the company into a public trust dedicated to addiction treatment. In exchange, they wanted complete immunity from future civil and criminal liability. It was a classic billionaire play. Buy your way out of accountability, admit nothing, and walk away. Victims and their families were outraged. Billions sounded like a lot, but it was a fraction of what the Sacklers had extracted from Purdue. And immunity meant no one would go to jail, no one would be criminally prosecuted, and the Sacklers would remain billionaires. Some states and families rejected the deal. They argued bankruptcy law wasn't designed to shield billionaires from accountability for intentional harms. But others, desperate for resources to address the crisis, reluctantly accepted. The settlement was messy, contested, and morally unsatisfying. Courts eventually approved a version of the settlement, though appeals continued for years. The Sacklers would pay, but they'd pay less than initially proposed. They'd lose Purdue, but they'd retain billions. They'd be shamed, but they'd avoid prison. For people who'd lost loved ones to OxyContin, the settlement felt like a betrayal. No amount of money could bring back the dead, and watching the Sacklers negotiate their way out of real consequences reinforced a bitter truth. In America, if you're rich enough, you can buy your way out of almost anything. The Sackler name was scrubbed from museums, but the family remained wealthy. They scattered, some moving abroad, others retreating from public life. Their philanthropic legacy, once celebrated, became synonymous with blood money. The slow-motion accountability offered no real justice. It exposed the limits of the legal system when confronted with wealthy, well-connected defendants. The Sacklers had helped create one of the deadliest public health crises in American history, and their punishment? Writing a check and losing some naming rights. Meanwhile, people convicted of possessing small amounts of drugs, victims of the same crisis, sat in prison cells, their lives destroyed by a system that criminalized addiction while letting its architects walk free. The Sackler trial wasn't really a trial. It was a settlement negotiation, a public relations disaster, and ultimately a reminder that accountability in America is tiered. If you cause harm as an individual, you face consequences. If you cause harm as a billionaire family hiding behind a corporation, you hire lawyers, file bankruptcy, and retire to your remaining fortune. The opioid crisis destroyed millions of lives. The people most responsible for starting it got to keep their wealth, their freedom, and most of their dignity. That's not justice. That's just how the system works. In 2016, the CDC finally issued new guidelines for opioid prescribing, urging doctors to limit doses, explore alternatives, and avoid long-term prescriptions for chronic pain. It was a necessary correction to years of reckless prescribing. But for patients already dependent, the guidelines felt like abandonment. Doctors, afraid of lawsuits or scrutiny, cut off prescriptions abruptly. Patients who'd been on opioids for years were tapered quickly or dropped entirely, often without support. Some turned to the street. Others suffered in untreated pain. A few took their own lives. The pendulum had swung too far in one direction, and now it was swinging back just as hard. The opioid crisis wasn't over. It was just reshaping again and again, with no clear end in sight. The CDC guidelines were well-intentioned. They recommended that doctors avoid or delay opioid prescriptions for chronic pain, start with the lowest effective dose, and prescribe no more than a 3 to 7 day supply for acute pain. They emphasized non-opioid alternatives, physical therapy, non-narcotic pain medications, behavioral interventions. For new patients, the guidelines made sense. They represented a return to the caution that had existed before Purdue's marketing blitz, but millions of people were already on long-term opioid therapy, prescribed during the years when aggressive pain management was standard practice. These patients suddenly found themselves caught in a backlash. Doctors who'd been prescribing opioids liberally now feared regulatory scrutiny. Medical boards were investigating high prescribers. The DEA was cracking down. And the easiest way to avoid problems was to stop prescribing opioids entirely. So doctors began tapering patients off, sometimes rapidly. Someone who'd been on opioids for years might be told their dose would be cut in half over a few months, then discontinued entirely. The medical rationale was that long-term opioid therapy often wasn't effective and carried significant risks. But for patients, it felt like betrayal. Many had organized their lives around their medication. They'd found jobs they could manage with pain control. They'd maintained relationships, cared for children, functioned. Now they were being told to stop, often with minimal support or alternative treatment options. Tapering too quickly caused withdrawal and severe pain spikes. Some patients couldn't work, others couldn't get out of bed, and the psychological toll was immense. Depression, anxiety, hopelessness. Some patients felt abandoned by doctors they trusted for years. A subset turned to the street, buying pills or heroin to manage withdrawal and pain. Others attempted suicide, overwhelmed by pain and the prospect of living without relief. Pain patient advocacy groups documented these cases, arguing the CDC guidelines were causing harm. The guidelines also created confusion. They were recommendations, not mandates, but many doctors and insurers treated them as hard limits. Patients prescribed more than the recommended 90 morphine milligram equivalents per day found their prescriptions flagged, questioned, or denied, even when medically appropriate. Pharmacies refused to fill legitimate prescriptions, citing the guidelines. Patients were accused of doctor shopping when they sought new providers after being tapered off. The stigma of opioid use intensified. People in genuine pain were treated with suspicion. The CDC later clarified that the guidelines weren't meant to result in rapid tapers or abandonment of patients. But the damage was done. The medical community had overcorrected. Years of overprescribing were followed by underprescribing, and patients caught in the middle suffered both ways. The guidelines also highlighted a fundamental problem. America doesn't have good alternatives for chronic pain management. Physical therapy is expensive and time-intensive. Non-opioid medications like gabapentin have their own side effects. Interventional procedures like nerve blocks aren't always effective. For some patients, opioids were the only thing that worked. Taking them away without offering viable alternatives left people in agony. And while preventing new addiction was important, abandoning people already dependent wasn't ethical or compassionate. The opioid crisis had created two overlapping tragedies: people dying from addiction and overdose, and people suffering from untreated pain. The CDC guidelines tried to address the first, but exacerbated the second. Public health is about balance, maximizing benefit while minimizing harm. The opioid crisis revealed how hard that balance is to achieve. Prescribed too freely, and addiction devastates communities. Prescribed too restrictively, and people suffer needlessly. The CDC guidelines were a necessary intervention, but they were also a reminder that there are no easy answers. Every policy creates winners and losers, and in the opioid crisis the losers kept piling up on both sides. Naloxone, sold under the brand name Narcan, is an opioid antagonist, a drug that can reverse an overdose in seconds. Administer it via nasal spray or injection, and it blocks opioid receptors in the brain, essentially snapping someone out of respiratory failure. It's been called a miracle drug, and in many ways it is. First responders, harm reduction programs, and even family members now carry Narcan routinely. It saved countless lives. But it's also a band-aid on a bullet wound. Narcan can bring someone back, but it doesn't fix addiction. It doesn't address the despair, the chronic pain, or the lack of treatment options. And for some, being revived just means waking up to face the same hopeless cycle again. Naloxone was synthesized in 1961, just a year after fentanyl. Its original purpose was clinical, reversing opioid overdoses in hospitals. Anesthesiologists used it when patients received too much pain medication during surgery. Emergency departments used it for heroin overdoses. It was a tool for medical professionals, locked away in crash carts and ambulance kits. But as the opioid crisis deepened, public health advocates realized naloxone needed to be more widely available. Overdoses were happening in homes, parks, gas station bathrooms, places where medical professionals weren't present. If bystanders could administer naloxone immediately, lives could be saved. Narcan nasal spray, approved in 2015, made naloxone accessible to non-medical users. No needles, no medical training required. Just insert the device in the nostril and press the plunger. The drug is absorbed through nasal membranes and reaches the brain within minutes. Harm reduction organizations began distributing Narcan for free. They trained people who used drugs, their friends and family members, on how to recognize an overdose and administer naloxone. Some states passed laws allowing pharmacists to dispense Narcan without a prescription, and providing legal immunity for people who administered it in good faith. The impact was immediate. Overdose reversals skyrocketed. Paramedics, police officers, and even librarians, anyone likely to encounter an overdose, received Narcan training. Some people were revived multiple times, brought back from the brink repeatedly. But Narcan created new ethical and practical challenges. Some critics argued it enabled drug use, that rescuing people from overdoses removed consequences and perpetuated addiction. This argument ignored both evidence and basic humanity. People don't overdose to get rescued, and dying isn't an effective deterrent. More practically, Narcan only buys time. It reverses an overdose temporarily, usually for 30 to 90 minutes. If the person overdosed on a long-acting opioid like methadone or fentanyl, the naloxone can wear off before the opioid does, causing a second overdose. That's why emergency medical care is still critical. Narcan also causes immediate withdrawal in opioid-dependent people. Being revived from an overdose means waking up in full withdrawal, nausea, pain, confusion, craving. Some people, revived by paramedics, refused transport to the hospital because they didn't want to face withdrawal in the ER. They'd walk away, use again, and sometimes overdose again. For first responders, Narcan became routine but also emotionally exhausting. They'd revive the same individuals repeatedly, watching them cycle through overdose, revival, and relapse. It was life-saving work, but it felt futile when the underlying addiction went untreated. Family members carrying Narcan faced impossible burdens. Parents kept it in their homes, hoping they'd never need it but knowing they might. Using Narcan on your own child, reviving them from an overdose in their bedroom is traumatic beyond measure, and Narcan didn't address why overdoses were happening. The drug supply was increasingly dangerous. Fentanyl made every use potentially lethal. People needed treatment, housing, mental health care, and economic opportunity, not just emergency reversal drugs. Still, Narcan saved lives. Tens of thousands of lives. People who might have died were given another chance. Some took that chance and found recovery. Others didn't, but they lived long enough to try. Public health advocates framed Narcan as a tool of compassion. Everyone deserves a chance at life, at recovery, at change. Opponents saw it as enabling. The debate revealed deeper disagreements about addiction, responsibility, and whose lives were worth saving. Narcan became a symbol of the opioid crisis, a drug that existed because so many others had failed. It was evidence of both the crisis's severity and society's willingness to at least try to save lives, however imperfectly. But Narcan couldn't solve the crisis. It could only pause it, one overdose at a time. And in a country where hundreds of people overdosed every day, even a miracle drug couldn't keep up. If you're struggling with opioid addiction in America, getting treatment is a gauntlet. Rehab facilities are expensive, often costing thousands of dollars for a month-long stay. Insurance coverage is inconsistent. Medication-assisted treatment like methadone or buprenorphine is stigmatized and heavily regulated. Waiting. Lists can stretch for weeks or months. In rural areas, treatment options barely exist, and even when someone does get help, relapse is common, not because of moral failure, but because addiction is a chronic condition that requires ongoing support. The gap between need and access is staggering. Millions want help, far fewer get it, and the crisis grinds on. The numbers are stark. An estimated 2 million Americans have opioid use disorder, but only about 20% receive treatment in any given year. The reasons for this gap are complex. Cost, availability, stigma, and structural barriers all play roles. Cost is prohibitive. A month at a residential treatment facility can run $10,000 to $30,000. Insurance may cover some of it, but often with high deductibles, co-pays, and limits on duration. Many people simply can't afford it. Public treatment programs exist, but they're underfunded and overwhelmed. Medication-assisted treatment, using methadone or buprenorphine to manage cravings and withdrawal, is effective but underutilized. Methadone is tightly regulated. It can only be dispensed through specialized clinics, and patients must visit daily, sometimes for years. This is a massive barrier for people with jobs, transportation issues, or child care responsibilities. Buprenorphine can be prescribed by physicians, but there are restrictions. Doctors need special training and a waiver from the DEA. Even then, they're limited in how many patients they can treat. Many doctors don't want the hassle or worry about attracting people seeking drugs to their practices. These regulations were meant to prevent diversion and misuse, but they also limited access to effective treatment. Someone struggling with heroin addiction might be willing to take buprenorphine to stabilize their life, but if there's no prescribing doctor within 50 miles, that option doesn't exist. Waiting lists compound the problem. When someone decides to seek treatment, often in a moment of crisis after an overdose or arrest, they're ready to change. But if they're told the wait for a treatment bed is 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, that window often closes. The motivation fades, the crisis passes, they use again. Geography creates additional barriers. Rural areas often have no addiction treatment infrastructure. The nearest methadone clinic might be an hour away. The nearest inpatient facility could be in another state. For people without cars or money for travel, these distances are insurmountable. Even when people access treatment, staying in treatment is hard. Residential programs pull people out of their lives, jobs are lost, housing becomes unstable, family relationships strain. After 30 days in rehab, people return to the same environment, stresses and triggers that contributed to their addiction. Without ongoing support, relapse is almost inevitable. Outpatient treatment can be more sustainable, but it requires discipline and support. Attending counseling sessions, taking medication consistently, avoiding triggers, all while managing work, family, and the daily stress of life, is difficult. Many people relapse not because they lack willpower, but because they lack support. Stigma remains a massive barrier. Addiction is still widely viewed as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. People fear judgment from employers, family, and healthcare providers. They avoid seeking help to avoid labels: addict, junkie, pill seeker. Healthcare providers themselves sometimes perpetuate stigma. Patients seeking treatment are treated with suspicion. Requests for medication-assisted treatment are denied because doctors believe it's just substituting one drug for another, a fundamental misunderstanding of how these medications work. The criminal justice system complicates things further. Many people with opioid use disorder end up incarcerated for drug-related offenses. Jails and prisons generally don't provide medication-assisted treatment. People are forced into withdrawal, a brutal, dangerous process, and released without support. Recidivism and overdose rates are high. The treatment gap isn't just about access, it's about quality too. Some treatment programs use evidence-based methods, medication-assisted treatment, counseling, and long-term support. Others rely on outdated approaches, abstinence-only models, confrontational therapy, or even tough love that shames and blames patients. The absence of standardized, regulated, high-quality treatment means people seeking help often get programs that don't work. They try rehab, it fails, and they feel hopeless, like they're broken, unfixable. Closing the treatment gap requires systemic change, more funding, better insurance coverage, fewer regulatory barriers, more trained providers, and an end to stigma. It requires treating addiction as a chronic disease requiring ongoing management, not an acute problem solved by a single month in rehab. Until that changes, millions of people will continue to struggle, wanting help but unable to access it. And the opioid crisis will grind on, fueled not just by drugs but by a healthcare system that abandons the people who need it most. The opioid crisis should have been a wake-up call for the pharmaceutical industry. It wasn't. Companies continue to push new drugs with aggressive marketing, downplayed risks and financial incentives for doctors. The tactics that fueled the opioid epidemic, biased studies, cherry-picked data, conflicts of interest, are still in play. Regulations exist, but enforcement is inconsistent. And while some companies have faced consequences, the broader system that allowed Purdue Pharma to thrive remains largely intact. The opioid crisis wasn't an anomaly. It was a case study in what happens when profit is prioritized over people, and the lessons, it seems, are still being ignored. In the years since Purdue's downfall, you'd think pharmaceutical companies would have learned something. You'd think they'd implement stricter internal controls, reject aggressive marketing tactics, and prioritize patient safety over quarterly earnings. You'd be wrong. The playbook hasn't changed much. It's just gotten more sophisticated. Pharmaceutical companies still wine and dine doctors. They still fund continuing medical education courses that just happen to emphasize their products. They still publish industry-sponsored research that minimizes risks and exaggerates benefits. The names have changed, the drugs are different, but the strategy remains the same. Create demand, capture the market, maximize profits. Take benzodiazepines, drugs like Xanax and Valium. These medications are highly addictive and dangerous when combined with opioids, which many patients were taking simultaneously. Yet pharmaceutical companies continued marketing them aggressively, and prescriptions soared alongside opioids. The combination created a deadly synergy. Central nervous system depressants, stacked on top of each other, multiplying overdose risk. Or look at gabapentin and pregabalin, drugs approved for nerve pain and seizures, but marketed off-label for everything from anxiety to insomnia. These drugs were positioned as safer alternatives to opioids, which was technically true but misleading. They're not opioids, but they're still addictive, have significant side effects, and are widely misused. Pharmaceutical companies pushed them hard, knowing doctors were desperate for non-opioid options. The marketing tactics evolved to be less obvious. Instead of sending sales reps directly to doctors' offices with catered lunches and branded swag, companies now fund patient advocacy groups that lobby for broader access to medications. They sponsor medical conferences where thought leaders, physicians paid handsomely as consultants, give talks that align suspiciously well with company messaging. They've also learned to weaponize data. Clinical trials are designed to show the best possible outcomes. Short-duration studies that don't capture long-term addiction risk. Carefully selected patient populations that exclude people most likely to have problems, and endpoints chosen to highlight benefits while minimizing harms. When results are published, negative findings are downplayed or omitted entirely. The pharmaceutical industry spent over $6 billion on marketing to physicians in 2020 alone. That's $6 billion in influence, relationships, and subtle pressure. It works. Studies consistently show that physician prescribing is influenced by marketing exposure. even when doctors insist they're immune to such tactics. Regulatory oversight remains inadequate. The FDA approves drugs based on efficacy and safety data provided largely by the companies seeking approval. The agency is chronically underfunded and relies heavily on user fees paid by pharmaceutical companies, a conflict of interest built into the system. Post-market surveillance, which monitors drugs after approval for unexpected problems, is passive and slow. When problems do emerge, penalties are often laughably small compared to profits. Purdue Pharma paid $635 million in fines in 2007 for misbranding OxyContin, a fraction of the billions they'd earned. The fine was treated as a cost of doing business, and the company kept selling. Other pharmaceutical companies watched and learned the wrong lesson. Not don't create addiction crises, but make sure your profits exceed potential penalties. It's a cynical calculation, but it's rational from a purely business perspective. The revolving door between industry and regulators doesn't help. FDA officials often leave to take high-paying jobs at pharmaceutical companies. Industry executives are appointed to regulatory positions. This creates both actual conflict of interest and the appearance of bias, undermining public trust. Some reforms have been attempted. The Sunshine Act requires pharmaceutical companies to disclose payments to doctors, making financial relationships more transparent. States have implemented prescription drug monitoring programs. The FDA has demanded stronger warnings on certain medications, but these are incremental changes to a fundamentally broken system. The core problem remains. Pharmaceutical companies are for-profit entities with a fiduciary duty to shareholders. That duty often conflicts with public health. When a company discovers its drug is causing harm, disclosing the information could tank stock prices and invite lawsuits. The incentive is to downplay, delay, and deny, until that fundamental conflict is resolved, either through stricter regulation, criminal accountability for executives, or restructuring how pharmaceuticals are developed and sold. The playbook won't change. Companies will continue prioritizing profit, and crises like the opioid epidemic will continue emerging. The opioid crisis wasn't caused by a few bad actors. It was enabled by a system that rewards aggressive marketing and tolerates deception as long as it's profitable. Purdue Pharma was just the most egregious example of a widespread problem. Big Pharma learned lessons from the opioid crisis, but they were the wrong ones. Be more subtle, diversify liability, and always make sure the profits outweigh the penalties. And so the cycle continues, with new drugs, new marketing campaigns, and the same old tactics dressed up in modern packaging. The next crisis is already brewing. We just haven't identified it yet. Behind every overdose statistic is a name, a face, a family left behind. Parents who found their children lifeless in a bathroom. Spouses who watched addiction hollow out the person they loved. Children growing up without parents, raised by grandparents or lost to foster care. The opioid crisis didn't just take lives. It fractured families, communities, and entire generations. Grief support groups overflow. Obituaries read like eulogies for potential. Beloved son, talented artist, devoted father gone too soon. And for many survivors, guilt lingers. Should I have seen the signs? Could I have done more? The human cost of the opioid crisis is impossible to quantify, but it's written in the empty chairs at Thanksgiving tables and the photos gathering dust on mantles across America. Statistics make the crisis comprehensible. 500,000 dead, millions addicted, billions in economic costs. But statistics don't capture what it feels like to bury your child. They don't convey the specific agony of watching someone you love deteriorate, their personality eroded by addiction, until they're a stranger wearing a familiar face. The stories are everywhere. A mother finds her 23-year-old son in his bedroom, a needle still in his arm. He'd been clean for 6 months, had a new job, seemed like he was turning things around. One relapse. One dose of fentanyl-laced heroin. Dead. A wife watches her husband transform from a loving partner into someone unrecognizable. He started taking Percocet after back surgery. The prescription ran out, but the need didn't. He borrowed money, stole from family, disappeared for days. She tried interventions, rehab, ultimatums. Nothing worked. Eventually, she had to choose between enabling his addiction and protecting herself and their children. The marriage ended. He overdosed 2 years later. A grandfather raises 3 children because both their parents are dead from overdoses. He's 72 on a fixed income trying to help kids process trauma. He barely understands himself. They ask questions he can't answer. Why did Mum choose drugs over us? Didn't Dad love us enough to stop? The grandfather does his best, but he's exhausted, grieving, and terrified of failing them too. These aren't abstractions. They're neighbours, classmates, co-workers. The opioid crisis doesn't discriminate. It hit wealthy suburbs and poor rural towns. It took honour students and struggling dropouts. It devastated families with resources and those barely getting by. The grief is complicated. When someone dies from overdose, survivors often face judgment. There's a cultural assumption that addiction is a choice, a moral failing, something that could have been prevented with better decisions or stronger willpower. So families grieve twice, once for the person they lost, and again for the lack of compassion from a society that blames victims. Obituaries become careful dances around truth. Died unexpectedly. Lost a long battle with illness. Families avoid mentioning addiction or overdose, afraid of stigma, worried people will think less of their loved one. It's a lonely grief, one that can't be fully shared or openly acknowledged. Support groups for families affected by addiction fill church basements and community centres. Parents share stories, cry together, and try to make sense of the senseless. Some find comfort in connecting with others who understand. Others leave feeling worse, reminded that their tragedy isn't unique, that hundreds of thousands of families are enduring the same nightmare. Children orphaned by the opioid crisis face lifelong consequences. Many live with grandparents who are too old, too tired, or too poor to provide stable homes. Others cycle through foster care, carrying trauma and grief they can't articulate. Rates of behavioural problems, academic struggles, and mental health issues are high among these children. The opioid crisis isn't just killing parents, it's damaging the next generation. Siblings of people who died from overdoses often carry survivor's guilt. They wonder why they didn't become addicted when their brother or sister did. They replay conversations looking for missed warnings. They ask themselves if they could have intervened differently, said something that would have changed the outcome. The guilt is irrational, but overwhelming. Spouses and partners face their own challenges. Loving someone with addiction means constant vigilance, checking for signs of use, hiding money, monitoring behaviour. It's exhausting and often futile. Many partners stay too long, hoping love will be enough to save someone who can only save themselves. When they finally leave, guilt follows. What if I'd stayed? What if I'd tried harder? The financial toll compounds the emotional one. Addiction drains resources. Families spend savings on rehab, legal fees, and emergency medical care. Some lose homes, retirement funds, college savings. The economic impact continues after death. Funeral costs, unpaid debts, lost income from time off work to grieve. Communities bear scars too. Small towns where everyone knows, everyone watched generations decimated. High school's graduate classes smaller than they should be. Empty seats representing students who didn't make it. Local economies struggle as addiction reduces the workforce, increases crime, and overwhelms social services. First responders, paramedics, police, firefighters, experience secondary trauma. They revive the same people repeatedly, knowing statistically many won't survive. They respond to overdoses in homes they recognize, sometimes involving people they know personally. The emotional toll is severe. PTSD, depression, and burnout are common. The opioid crisis created a generation of trauma. Children who lost parents, parents who lost children, grandparents raising grandchildren, communities losing identity as addiction hollowed them out. The pain radiates outward, touching everyone connected to the person who died or the person still using. And through it all, the question haunts survivors. Could I have done more? The answer is usually no. Addiction is powerful. Treatment is limited, and sometimes people can't be saved despite everyone's best efforts. But guilt doesn't respond to logic. It lingers, heavy and persistent, one more casualty of a crisis that took so much already. The human cost of the opioid epidemic isn't measured in these dollars or statistics. It's measured in shattered families, broken communities, and a collective grief that will echo for generations. Every number represents someone's child, parent, sibling, friend, someone who mattered, who was loved, who is profoundly missed. And the tragedy continues. Every day, more families join the ranks of those grieving overdose deaths, adding to a toll that seems endless. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your climate-controlled bedroom with your bottle of ibuprofen safely child-proofed in the cabinet, maybe take a moment to think about all of this. The opioid crisis didn't happen by accident. It wasn't an act of God or an unavoidable natural disaster. It was built carefully and deliberately by people who knew exactly what they were doing. It started with a flower that's been with us for thousands of years, promising relief and delivering dependency in equal measure. It continued through morphine addiction after the Civil War, through Bayer's catastrophic heroin experiment, through decades when we actually seemed to understand that opioids were dangerous. And then, somewhere in the 1990s, we collectively forgot. Or rather, we were made to forget by pharmaceutical companies with sales quotas and marketing budgets bigger than some countries' GDPs. The Sackler family didn't invent oxycodone. They didn't discover some new chemical compound hidden in a laboratory. They just repackaged an old drug, slapped a time-release coating on it, and convinced America that this time would be different. That this opioid was safe. That addiction was rare. That pain was undertreated and doctors were being cruel by withholding relief. It was a lie, but it was a lie told so confidently, so repeatedly, and with so much money behind it that an entire nation believed it. Doctors prescribed in good faith. Patients took their medication as directed, and millions ended up dependent, not because they were weak or morally flawed, but because opioids do what opioids have always done. They relieve pain beautifully and create addiction ruthlessly. Percocet was there through it all. The quiet sibling that never grabbed headlines but filled just as many medicine cabinets. It wasn't marketed as aggressively as OxyContin, but it didn't need to be. Once the culture shifted, once prescribing opioids became normalized, Percocet rode that wave into millions of homes. And when people couldn't get pills anymore, they turned to heroin. And when heroin wasn't strong enough or available enough, fentanyl filled the gap. Each wave deadlier than the last. Over 500,000 Americans are dead. That's more than all the Americans who died in World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined. It's a staggering, almost incomprehensible number. But each of those deaths was a person. Someone's child, parent, sibling, friend. Someone who laughed and dreamed and mattered. Someone whose absence left a hole that can never be filled. The crisis revealed ugly truths about America. It showed us that our healthcare system prioritizes profit over people, that our drug laws punish the vulnerable while protecting the powerful, that we're willing to let hundreds of thousands die as long as the right people are making money. and it exposed the brutal inequality in how we respond to suffering. When addiction hit black communities in the 80s and 90s, we built prisons. When it hit white suburbs in the 2000s, we talked about compassion and treatment. But the crisis also revealed something else: resilience. Families who lost loved ones became advocates, demanding change and accountability. Harm reduction workers distributed Narcan and saved lives, one overdose reversal at a time. Survivors found recovery and built new lives from the wreckage. Communities came together to support each other through unimaginable grief. People refused to give up, even when the system seemed designed to break them. The opioid crisis isn't over. Fentanyl still kills dozens of Americans every single day. People still struggle to access treatment. Families still grieve. And pharmaceutical companies still operate with the same playbook, just slightly more carefully, with better lawyers and more sophisticated marketing. But we know better now. We've seen what happens when corporate greed meets regulatory failure and medical hubris. We've watched an entire generation lost to pills that promised relief and delivered devastation. We've learned, painfully and expensively, that there are no miracle drugs, only trade-offs, risks, and consequences. So as you close your eyes tonight, remember the people this crisis took. Remember the parents who found their children dead. Remember the children growing up without parents. Remember the communities hollowed out by addiction. Remember the doctors who prescribed in good faith and the patients who trusted them. Remember the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma and every pharmaceutical executive who chose profit over lives. But also remember that change is possible, that accountability, however slow and incomplete, can happen, that we can build a better system if we have the courage to demand it. That addiction is a disease, not a moral failing, and people deserve compassion, treatment, and second chances. The opioid crisis taught us that pain is complicated, that relief comes with costs, and that the pills we trust can betray us. It taught us to read the fine print, question authority, and never assume that just because something is legal and prescribed by a doctor, it's safe. Most of all, it taught us that we're all vulnerable. Addiction doesn't discriminate. It can start with a prescription after surgery, a pill borrowed from a friend, or a moment of desperation when the pain, physical or emotional, becomes too much to bear. None of us are immune. We're all just one injury, one prescription, one bad decision away from a struggle we never saw coming. So sleep well, tonight. And tomorrow, maybe check on the people you love. Ask how they're doing. Really doing. Notice the signs. Offer help without judgment. Support treatment over incarceration. Demand accountability from the companies and systems that failed us. And remember that behind every statistic, every policy debate, every settlement and lawsuit, there are human beings, fragile, hopeful, deserving of care. The story of Percocet and the opioid crisis is still being written. The ending isn't determined yet. But if we've learned anything from the hundreds of thousands who died, it's this: we can't afford to look away, to forget, or to let it happen again. Good night, stay safe, and maybe, just maybe, let's build a world where pain relief doesn't come at the cost of so many lives.